third year at PSConf.eu. I love this conference. I love interacting with you guys. It's been awesome so far. Hope everybody's having a good time. So today we're going to cover Active Directory domain trust, enumeration, abuse, and kind of mapping through mostly PowerView, which is one of the tool sets that I've written over the past several years. It's kind of like a recoded version almost of some of the Active Directory commandlets, but in a version 2 compatible way that's a single self-contained script. And originally we used this for a lot of offensive components or a lot of offensive tradecraft, but we know a lot of defenders that use it as well. There's some functionality in there that isn't necessarily in the Active Directory commandlets, but I also just wrote it in my spare time. I'm not Microsoft, but I'll try to cover some of the cool functionality today. So we'll do a really quick domain trust crash course, enumeration through some .NET methods, enumeration through LDAP, and kind of outline what has ended up being our domain trust attack strategy. I'll also cover exactly why the forest is the trust boundary and not a domain, which I know is self-evident or obvious to a lot of people here, a lot of sysadmins, but we still see a lot of environments that do not set up their domain trust architecture correctly. And then I'll try to walk through an example, trust audit example with some stuff that I have up in Azure. So when I started pen testing and started doing a lot of like hacking and red teaming, I didn't know what domain trusts were. My very first engagement, my former NSA boss, we're operating. He's like, oh yeah, there's a trust. Just run NL test, just hop it, just whatever. And I had no idea what he was talking about. So I started diving into this, reading a lot of Microsoft documentation. I was trying to understand really what is a trust, exactly how it operates. So all it does, the whole point of a trust, is it allows two disparate domains to form an interconnected relationship. All the trust actually does, as I understand it, is it links up the authentication system of two domains and allows authentication traffic through the form of Kerberos referrals to flow between them. So these two domains, when they set up a trust, they exchange an inter-realm trust key, a secret negotiated cryptographic key that allows them to encrypt Kerberos referral tickets and relay them between each other. That's pretty much all it is. There's a lot of caveats with the types and like how they operate and things. But yeah, again, inter-realm trust key. So the communication in the system works through a system of referrals. So if you're in domain A and you request a service ticket to access a service principal name in domain B, your domain will say, oh, okay, I don't have this resource in my domain, but a domain I trust does. So I'm going to encrypt this person's ticket granting ticket into a Kerberos referral that's encrypted with that inter-realm trust key, and I'm going to throw it over to domain B. Domain B gets that referral, decrypts it and verifies it because it's encrypted with that same key that first domain exchanged with it. And then domain B says, okay, here's the ticket granting ticket. This person says they're willed in groups A, B, and C, and I'm going to trust that that is accurate because domain A authenticated them. Cool. I know you can't really see that link too well. I'll put up the slides onto the PSConf.eu repository as well as tweeting them out after this talk. But I wrote a 35-page blog post for, it's kind of like a security or red teamer perspective on Active Directory trust. So I go into excruciating detail on a lot of these components. So there's a lot of different trust types. Tree root, crosslink, external, parent-child, all this kind of stuff. But ultimately what we care about is if a domain trust exists within a forest or if it's outside of the forest. Because a trust is the only security boundary or guarantee, it's like, our guarantee of security within pretty much, the realm of Active Directory. So domains within a forest have this implicit relationship that we're going to talk about from like kind of an attacker or security standpoint. So we ultimately just care, are a bunch of these trusts within the same forest, or are they not in the same forest? So interforest trusts, so within forest trusts, so parent-child, tree root, and crosslink have a specific attack that's been known for a long, long time, where you can abuse an Active Directory property called SID history to turn the administrative access of any child domain into enterprise admin access, essentially. And I'll go over that attack in detail and why that's possible. It's a really, really cool attack. Forests that are inter-forest trusts, so they're external, so these are like external trust links or forest-to-forest trust links, have a security protection called SID filtering that prevents this very specific type of abuse. All right, enough of me talking. I'm going to see if, let's see, I got to mirror my, all right, sweet. Okay. So I'm going to go over some of the, just kind of jump into some of the old school enumeration through .NET. First, like this is traditionally what a lot of admins are used to, of just running NL test. So I'm currently I've got a 6-part domain kind of trust setup, and I'll go over a full mapping of it in the full audit example. But classically what people would use, is NL test, whack domain trust or whack all trust. And you get some stuff like, okay, this is quarantined, external, tree root, all that kind of stuff. Some of the terminology is kind of confusing if you're not as familiar with it, but I'll start going over some of these pieces. So with .NET and the really nice access to .NET through PowerShell, the first thing that we started kind of diving into was the system.directory services.active directory namespace, as well as the associated domain subclasses and some of the methods. So starting like, okay, I'm starting to examine this. There's a handful of methods here. There is a get current domain method, which will start to give me some contextual information about this particular domain that I'm in. So I'm in this external trust, honcho.external.local. Oh, and actually, no, sorry, I got to switch. So I'm in the external one, and I want to show you the semi-internal one. One second. Clean up all the demos. All right. Still too early. I ran over here trying to get adapters, and I don't have coffee. So, all right, domain. Sorry. Okay. I'll try to zoom in as much as I can. So zoom in more. Is that a little bit better? Okay. So I'm in the sub.dev.testlab.local domain. So I want to start exploring this and say like, okay, what type of methods are here for me? I'm also just reading MSDN. I just want to kind of walk through a little bit for the demo. There's a huge amount of stuff that you can pull out of this a particular domain object through this namespace in .NET. One of the first ones that we started diving into was just get all trust relationships. So this gives you a nice translated, I'm in sub.dev.testlab.local. I have a relationship with dev. That makes sense. That's parent-child, bidirectional. I also have this external trust that's one way, so it's only outbound. And I'll go over kind of why that matters. Also, I mentioned that SID filtering protection. There's also methods that really easily, let you determine if SID filtering is enabled or not. So we see for this external one, so it's external, not within the same forest, these SIDs are going to be filtered out of the Kerberos referral ticket. But if I, for example, do dev.testlab.local, there is no SID filtering because that's a parent-child within the same forest. So that kind of makes sense. There's also an equivalent namespace for forest themselves. So forest trust are technically, they're technically different than domain trust, so you have to use a different namespace to actually pull them out. But there's a lot of information you can start to pull out from some of these .NET methods, like all of the global catalogs, all of the domains contained within the forest, and you can enumerate all this information from any single kind of domain subnode within the forest. And then forests themselves have trust relationships. So I'm in that testlab.local forest, and there is a trust relationship between that testlab.local forest and the contoso.local forest. And I'll have this nice little picture and kind of an architecture for it for this to start to make sense. But yeah, so there's a huge amount of internal .NET methods that can let you start to do this enumeration and things in a little bit more granularity than just using NL test. So NL test wraps some specific API calls, 132 API calls under the hood, which is awesome, but it also sometimes, in some cases, limits the amount of information you can pull out, and .NET has a whole lot more stuff for us. So there's those .NET methods that ultimately reduce down to a bunch of like RPC calls under the hood that I don't fully understand, haven't gotten quite to that level yet, but you can also enumerate these through LDAP. So when a domain establishes a trust with another domain, a foreign domain is stored as a trusted domain object in Active Directory. So you can pull these really easily in any way that you can manually just do your LDAP queries. You can use your dsquery, dsfind, adfind.exe from Joeware, or you can use ADSI and ADSI searcher through PowerShell, which is kind of our preference. With the object class is just trusted domain. There's a couple of different characteristics on trust that I'll go over that were slightly confusing to me when I started, but specifically the trust type, it's, again, Microsoft's naming sometimes leaves, I think it's just very engineering. To me, it sometimes leaves a little bit to be desired as far as, trying to have something make sense so it's not quite as confusing when you're starting out, but you have down level, up level, and MIT. Down level meaning a Windows domain without Active Directory, an old NT4 domain, which I don't think I've seen one of these in the field. 99% of the time it's up level, meaning a Windows domain that does implement Active Directory. And then MIT is going to be any like Unix or Linux, RFC, I forget the number, compliant Kerberos implementation. So these will start to show up in some of the LDAP queries that we'll see. And last, some of the trust attributes. There's a couple of different things, treating as external, forest to forest, quarantining, filter SIDs. The one I really care about as an attacker is the within forest trust attribute. So again, we care about if it's within the same forest, because the SID, attacking SID history to hop up a forest trust. So I just tend to look for this particular trust attribute for within forest or not. All right, I'm going to show you some LDAP stuff. All right, cool. LDAP enumeration. So we can really easily use an ADSI searcher object with that object class trusted domain, finding all the results, and then we can just start to pull. We'll see some of the raw stuff that comes out here. So some of these raw results, you actually have to translate certain things with like GUIDs and SIDs and things like that, and I'll show some of that in PowerView. But you start to see there's a lot more contextual information that can come out when we're approaching this from an LDAP enumeration, as opposed to that NL test that just says parent-child, here to here, and that's it. Instead, we get like when the trust was created, some more of these trust attributes, when it was modified, like who the partner is, things like that. Let's see. Now, we're going to import module PowerView. Invoke Mimikatz. What is that doing there? 1 second. I think I have, where is this? Documents. Okay. So again, single self-contained PS1 script, because as attackers we like to run version 2 compliant self-contained PS1s that we can run through a remote agent. Let's see, git command trust. And there's a large amount of, or there's a pretty good number of functions within PowerView that were built to enumerate and abuse a lot of these trusts. So I think you see like anything without source will start to show up. There's like enumeration, there's mappings, and I'll walk through a couple of them. So by default, git domain trust is the LDAP enumeration wrapper that I built that pulls out and translates just the fields I kind of care about. So, source target, I actually translate Windows Active Directory or Windows Not Active Directory or Linux because it makes a little bit more sense to me. Trust attributes we see, for that external one with that SID filtering, we get that filter SIDs. For these ones within the forest, we get that within forest. Makes sense. There's a couple flags for git domain trust. Instead, if you want to use the .NET method without having to remember the namespace and all the syntax, you can do git domain trust tech.net. And also, to be complete, I implemented the same API that NL test essentially uses as well. So you get some of the same information for the trust type, up level, down level. The flags are within forest, primary, and some of that stuff. You also get the GUID for the domains, which you don't get through the LDAP method. Again, because forest trusts are technically different, there's a different commandlet for it, wrapping a different namespace. So we have, that's that, just a wrapper again for that .NET namespace, kind of long one-liner for get all forest trust. And you can also search for trust through the global catalog. So if you're not familiar, that's okay. It's like don't want to touch anything. So the global catalog is a partial representation of all objects in a forest. And each domain within the forest at least one domain controller keeps a copy of the global catalog. So all usernames, group names, things like that, and all trusted domain objects, amongst many, many other things, are replicated in this global catalog. So if there's a change, that partial copy is replicated to all domains in the forest. So one thing I'll tend to do in a really large trust environment is query the global catalog for trusted domain objects by changing the search space to be GC for global catalog and then whatever my current domain is. And then I get all the trusted domain objects for every domain in the entire forest instead of just my current domain. So I had that previous stuff that came back for, let's see, there's a whole lot more stuff. So we had that previous sub.dev.testlab and dev. We also see dev and testlab. That makes sense. Let's see, dev and sub, kind of the, reciprocal. And we also start to see some of those external forest-to-forest trusts with testlab. Cool. It keeps flickering. And it makes it for a really quick and easy way to enumerate all the trusted relationships for every domain within the entire forest. One of the other things we'll tend to do is we can try to enumerate that stuff through the global catalog, but when you have domain trust, you have something called transitivity. So if A trusts B and B trusts C, then A can trust C, and you can have those referral tickets flow between multiple domains. So what we'll often do is, okay, I can get all the domains that I trust, and because of that, I can get information from that domain. I can query information from it. Why don't I do like a mapping, a recursive mapping of trying to see all the domains that are trusted in this entire mesh? So get domain trust mapping will do just that. And it'll go through and try to go to the primary domain controller for every domain using some of this LDAP stuff wrapped in the PowerShell functions. And then it'll try to pull all the trust information it possibly can, it can possibly reach, depending on network segmentation and things like that. So then we'll often, just export that to our nice CSV with no type information, take that CSV, and we have some tools that will turn that into GraphML and let you actually visualize these really, really nicely. And that link in the post, in one of those first slides to that domain trust post, walks through that method in detail. Yes? The question was, is this something I should not be running on my corporate network? I've run it in corporate networks a lot, so it's all, it's kind of my job. So all it's basically doing is LDAP queries under the hood, and when you're doing the recursive mapping to other domains, it's trying to reach the primary domain controller for, like, if I say testlab.local, it looks up, tries to connect to the primary DC, and then just do one LDAP query to pull down trusted domain object. You will have a connection to each the PDC in each foreign domain, but outside of that, there's nothing inherently malicious in this. It's just pulling, LDAP information. But good question. Also, because if a trust exists, you can query any information from Active Directory in a domain that trusts you, which I kind of I think obvious, but it trips some people up. So, I can do things like get all the computers in a foreign domain, get all the users, get all the GPOs, and PowerView has, because I wanted to build it to handle trust really, really easily, any get TAC domain something enumeration function in PowerView accepts a TAC domain flag where you just pass it the foreign domain name and super easily it'll pull any of this information out. All right. Yeah, just for example, let me pull all the GPOs in a different domain, and Active Directory is meant to give you information, so it very nicely does that across trust as well. Cool. All right, so our general trust attack strategy. The general idea here is we want to find this kind of hidden trust mesh of nested crossing relationships that administrators have set up in the past, very often kind of incorrectly. So the first thing we'll do is just that basic enumeration that I talked about. So that mapping, find all the domains of forest that you're able to reach from your current context. This will vary based on the exact nature of the trust setup, and also vary on network segmentation, or if you're trying to enumerate that PDC in a foreign domain, and there's network segmentation that stops you, you're going to get incomplete information in some context. But we want to build a visualization of the map of all the domains and their exact relationships between each other. Then we want to find security principles, so users or groups or computers in one domain that have access to resources in another domain, so something that crosses a trust boundary. Or we also want to find groups in a domain that contain principals, not another domain. So again, just finding these like nested relationships that cross some of these trust boundaries. So then we have a complete access map of what users can like cross these boundaries and access resources and kind of hop across a domain trust from a security perspective. Then we'll compromise specific targeted accounts in one domain that lets you, if you compromise those, assume access to resources in a different domain. So that's what we mean by kind of hopping across these trusts. If you are trying to cross an intra-forest trust, so parent-child within the same forest, then the SID history hopping thing, which I'll talk about in a second, is definitely an option. But, again, this isn't super complicated, but it was something we just kind of stumbled upon after auditing a lot of domain trust relationships. And again, I'm not an Active Directory security admin. I'm not DevOps, I'm not an AD architect. I've learned a lot of this piecemeal, so even if it's somewhat simplistic, there's a large number of people, especially in the security community, that don't understand the system for these things and don't understand the subtleties and don't know quite as well how they can actually attack domain trust. So, hop back to another. All right, let's start to enumerate some of these cross-domain relationships. All right. So there's a couple functions in PowerView that I built to try to facilitate this. There's getDomainForeignUser, which will find users who are in groups outside of the user's domain. So this is kind of like a domain's outgoing access. There's a weird caveat with as far as like group scoping and, all right, some of this stuff, where this will only work for intra-forest trusts because of foreign security principles, which I'll get into in a second. We see here, I'm again, still in that subdomain. There's sub-user 1, and they are in a universal group in dev.testlab.local. So even if I can't elevate to domain admin or equivalent rights in this child domain, if I'm able to compromise this sub-user 1, they might be in groups or have access to resources and be in local admins or something in this parent domain. So we would enumerate this, and if we get access to their account, we're going to start kind of manually walking up the domain trust tree as far as compromises go. Again, these functions also work across a trust. So we also see dev user 1 in our direct parent that is also now nested up in the forest root. So again, this is how you can start to walk some of these nested relationships up. And the inverse of that is getDomainForeignGroupMember. So give me, enumerate groups that have users that are outside of that group's primary domain. So this is like a domain's incoming access. If I run this against my current domain, sub, again, I have, some foreign security principles, which I'll go over in a second. You have things like schema admins and enterprise admins being nested in, local administrators. That makes sense, kind of how trusts are set up. What's more interesting is if I run it against my direct parent, I see, let's see some of the stuff that starts to pop up. So I see that inverse of that fine domain foreign user that we ran previously, to where we have that sub-user 1 who is nested in a, that dev universal group. So again, just two sides of the same coin. But depending on where you are and what direction you're trying to go, it's either that outgoing kind of nested access for a domain or that incoming kind of group nested access. So foreign security principles and some of the stuff that kind of popped up. So here, if you've ever seen that CN equals that, giant security identifier and foreign security principles. So if you have an external trust, and you add a foreign user from an external trust into a group in your domain. Sorry, it keeps flickering. Like every 3 seconds, like the whole screen goes fuzzy. Okay, all right, well, we'll just keep going. So if I have external.local and I'm trying to add a user into, dev.testlab.local or sub.dev.testlab.local, what happens is Active Directory will create basically this like kind of alias object called a foreign security principal. It's always in the same location. It's always CN 40 security principles, and then whatever the domain is. And this first part, the CN equals and the security identifier, is the security identifier for the user in the foreign domain. So when that user authenticates in, they auth in, they get the referral ticket. Their security identifier is essentially mapped to this foreign security principal alias, and this alias object is actually what's added to any of the groups in this particular domain. So what's nice with this is it makes it really easy for us to map all the incoming like foreign relationships, foreign user nested relationships into a domain. So we can do that really easily, again, with that global catalog.
So they're always 1521.
They're always 1521. If it's, I mean, I think that's the prefix, the standard like domain, meaning like it's a, I knew this at some point, but yeah, it's, if it's like, you know, a full like domain SID, or like, you know, a proper full domain SID, not a built-in one, or one of the built-in aliases, it should be the S1521. But yeah, so I can really easily pull out all these foreign security principles for everything in the entire forest by querying this in the global catalog. So I see stuff into sub, see stuff into dev, and see stuff into test lab. So these are any of the outside coming in relationships for any domain within the entire forest. I'm going to skip the ACL stuff really quick, but just another side note. Outside of group nesting, these users and groups, these principles, can also be principles in ACL-based information. So some of these foreign people could maybe have edit rights or force reset password rights, or maybe they can edit a GPO and things like that. That's a little bit harder to audit at scale. It's a lot more time consuming. You can do it with PowerView or the Active Directory commandlets. That's also something that we started to try to build into Bloodhound, if anyone saw Walter's talk yesterday. Also, the last way that, that foreign relationships are used is they can be nested in local security groups. So someone can be directly added to like the local administrators for a system. That gets a little bit trickier to map at scale, as you have to technically enumerate every single system and try to get that information. Again, Bloodhound can do this, but that's a lot more time consuming, and that's something that's you are much more likely to be caught, or I wouldn't necessarily recommend running that in your enterprise environment unless you know what you're doing, or the admins say it's okay. It's just a lot more noise if you're touching every system instead of just doing an LDAP query to your primary domain controller. So, why the forest is the trust boundary. Benjamin Delpy, who's the author of Mimikatz, he's a French security researcher, like super awesome. He did some work a couple years ago, or 3 years ago, with Sean Metcalf, who runs adsecurity.org, which is a phenomenal Active Directory security resource for anyone interested. And this is basically Benjamin's documentation. He just tweets random stuff with his like partial French, partial English part of the time, and then everyone's like, oh, that's weird, and no one really understands the full implications till months later. So his documentation being, external sends Mimikatz tickets, same forest, external without filtering. I fully understand what this means now, but at first, in this like these cryptic screenshots, I'm like, what the heck does this actually mean? So, what this means is, when you're doing these Kerberos referrals, you're in your domain A and you get a referral ticket to domain B. Say those are within the same forest, parent-child. Within your ticket granting ticket in Kerberos, there's the PAC, which is the Privileged Access Certificate. It contains several things, including the user security identifier, all the security identifiers for any effective groups that they're in, and things that are in SID history. SID history is an Active Directory property that was meant for like old NT4 domain migrations from like NT4 or other domains to newer Active Directory domains. And what would happen is, you create a new user, your new domain, and you set SID history to have the security identifiers of any of the user's old groups or what their old SID actually was. So then when that user tries to access some resource, Active Directory will look in SID history and say, okay, I will also grant access to anything that is in this property. So again, it was meant as a migration component. So say you have the domain admin SID in your SID history property. It's as if you are a domain admin. Within the forest, Active Directory will respect this, again, meant for migration. So this has been known as a really potentially bad thing for a long time, or a sensitive thing for a long time. Because, again, what if you could get your SID history to be set to be domain admins or something like that, or specifically, say you're in a child domain, and you somehow get your SID history set to the enterprise admins. Within the forest, normally, if you're presenting all these tickets, certain security identifiers will be filtered out or ignored. On that, you go from domain A to domain B. It looks at all those SIDs and everything in your identifier group SIDs and SID history. And in many cases, if there's certain sensitive security identifiers like enterprise admins, those are like filtered out and that ticket is ignored. But the enterprise admin SID is not filtered out for domains within the same forest. It is for external. So if you're external.local to dev.testlab.local, if you have enterprise admins in your SID history, that is filtered out when you try to present that ticket to the new domain. So that's SID filtering. But within the same forest, that domain tech 519, the enterprise admin SID, is not filtered out. So if you're in a child domain, somehow convince Active Directory that you have the enterprise admin SID in your SID history, then you can instantly become an enterprise admin and kind of hop up a trust forest mesh. So this is why the forest is the trust boundary. Now, this has been known by Microsoft for a long, long time. It's part of the architecture, like they know what they're doing there. So they make it extremely difficult to modify SID history. It's very, very, very hard to modify SID history. But what Benjamin realized, so like it's a protected attribute, you would actually have to have code execution on a domain controller, and they make it very, very difficult to modify SID history even if you're running with admin rights on a DC. Well, what Benjamin realized is with golden tickets, because we're forging our own ticket granting tickets, and we can put whatever we want in that ticket, why don't we just put that SID history in the golden ticket? So we're not actually modifying anything in the Active Directory database, we're modifying just a single ticket structure that we have injected in. So that's what he means by this. This is in Mimikatz. I've used this in the field, bad guys have used this in the field, to where if you gain domain admin rights in the child domain, you can recover the KRB TGT signing key for that child domain. You create a golden ticket pretending you're domain admin in that child domain, and then the only difference is you do whack SIDS : the security identifier of the enterprise admins for the forest root, and I'll walk through this in the demo. And then that user in that child domain can instantly become an enterprise admin and compromise every domain in the entire forest, which is kind of scary to me. Blew my mind when, I'm an Active Directory geek, so it blew my mind when I actually did that in the field the first time. But the reason this is difficult the reason this really matters is many organizations have set up their trust architecture incorrectly. A lot of people had operated under the assumption that the domain was kind of the trust boundary, or there'd be no way to hop up. So we've had examples like in the field. A couple of years ago, we were doing an engagement for a client that had offices in the US and in Europe. And the one particular domain that was in, like one of these countries, or it was in Belgium or Germany or something like that. They had like semi-isolated and kind of contained, they had firewalls and all this type of stuff. Because it was a new acquisition, they're like, we don't quite trust it yet, we want to kind of isolate it, so we want to protect the forest root out in the US. So we were able to compromise domain admin in that child domain in Europe. And we couldn't directly talk to anything in the US, but domain controllers have to be able to talk to each other to replicate. So we hopped up to the domain controller for the domain in Europe, did the SID history hopping attack, and then compromised the complete forest root in the US because their architecture assumed that they could like kind of isolate a domain by domain trust boundary, not realizing like, oh, anything in the same forest, compromise of one domain admin cred for anything in the entire forest means compromise of everything in the entire forest. And what also kind of sucks is that the fix for that is your domain trust architecture is broken, like rebuild it, I guess. And they're like, yeah, that'd be $30 million. And I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, I don't know, sorry. But like, we'll come back next year and break it again if you want. Like, okay, so now I've got just about like 5 or 10 minutes, so I'll try to pick up just a little bit. This is an example kind of domain trust architecture. This is, from the examples I was doing, I was in sub.dev.testlab.local. This is visualized through a program called YED, an open source visualization platform based on some of the GraphML from a domain trust mapping. So all these colors mean something. Green is within the same forest, red is external, blue is forest to forest, so external as well. So say we land in external.local, like how would I approach like auditing this type of relationship? So if I land there, I would first check what are the trusts. I see there is a one-way trust. Then I would try to see, because these arrows are direction of access, not the direction of the trust itself. I would try to see, are there any users in external.local that are in groups in sub.testlab.local? So like any of those users that cross that boundary. Then if I'm able to elevate an external.local and, compromise anyone's hashes that I want, I would use the specific hashes of our specific access from the people that cross that boundary to then assume those rights and then try to see maybe they have access to certain resources in sub.testlab.local. Then from sub, I would do my normal domain escalation and I would try to elevate to domain admin. The moment I elevate to domain admin in sub.testlab.local, I can instantly hop up the root and compromise the entire testlab.local forest. Then again, that's external from there to Contoso, so I need to do the, that external, like foreign user group, kind of manual type enumeration to see if there's any users in this forest that have access to any resources in the other forest. Then I would repeat, get those hashes, hop across, then I'm at the root, so then I could assume access for prod. Okay, let's see here. Let's go Magic Azure. This is really nice actually to be able to put up like 6, 7 domains in a trust in a couple hours without running off my VM. So again, we're in, let's say we had crossed from external into sub, right? Oh yeah, so we kind of skipped that first part of like external into sub. Then say I'm able to elevate. So again, it's not like you can just magically exploit these trusts or whatever else. This is relying upon misconfigurations for people that have this stuff already there. So I definitely wanted to show you guys the SID hopping attack. So okay, I'm using Mimikatz, my Kerberos Golden. I have the KRB TGT Kerberos signing key for my sub.dev.testlab.local. I have the security identifier for my current domain. I'm going to pretend to be a domain admin, local admin. I'm doing it for my current domain, sub.dev. And the only difference is this is the full security identifier for the enterprise admins group in the testlab.local forest. So this is how easy it is. Hacking can be easy sometimes. Oh, that's why I need to invoke Mimikatz. Okay. All right, run this. Go Magic Mimikatz. All right, there we go. Okay, so Mimikatz gives me some nice information coming back. I'm doing everything normal. And then it says extra SID, so that's that SID history component. And now, even though I'm in sub.dev.testlab.local, I can access the primary domain controller for the forest root, which the first time I did that, again, just blew my mind. So really, really cool. To me, at least. I don't know if you guys have not, it's like, it's always so quiet in here. I'm like, hopefully it's cool. Yeah, very scary, right? To where, and again, it's now you realize that the compromise of any domain admin creds for any domain in the entire forest, within 5 minutes, I can turn that into compromise of every resource in the entire forest. So that's bad. This also means that if people know about changing or rotating the KRB TGT account to combat golden tickets, if you rotate that in one child domain, you would have to rotate it in all child domains all at the same time twice in order to ensure that people, are, like that you've actually kicked all the bad guys out for that. Because if there's like a window or a couple of days, right, if someone still has access to a different child domain, they could just hop up again and then re-own everything. So let's see. Okay, I don't know if this part will actually work. Please, nope. What'd you say? Oh, yeah. There we go. All right. There we go. Cool. So I've compromised all the way up. I'm now an enterprise admin in contoso.local. I want to see what trust that has, and I see that outgoing trust, or, I'm in testlab.local, and I have that outgoing trust at Contoso. And I also see that there's prod. So again, from all the way down here in sub, I'm able to enumerate all the information because those forest-to-forest trusts are transitive and they can, relay stuff between each other. I'm able to pull that information out, see what prod is, and start to enumerate some of these relationships again. So let's see if I think there should be some foreign group members. Oh, Contoso, yep, same bug. There we go. All right. So then I see some of those foreign security principles again. So these SIDs are for people within, this testlab.local forest that are in some type of group in contoso.local. So these domain local groups have these particular people. So, then from that point, I would resolve these SIDs to figure out what users are in my current domain, DC sync or otherwise compromise their hashes, and then use that access to then try to hop across again to that foreign domain. All right. So kind of starting to wrap up. Again, I've said that pretty much 800 times. The forest is the trust boundary, not the domain. There's a whole, PowerShell makes it super, super easy to automate up the enumeration of this type of stuff and doing the recursive mappings and things like that. All that is technically possible through something like NL test, or wrapping API calls or doing this manually, but PowerShell just acted as, like the perfect glue for us of like auditing a lot of this information at scale and doing things like those foreign group and user enumerations. All that's doing, it's pulling down like a user object, it pulls down a group object, looks at all the member properties, and then looks at the distinguished names for those, and then checks if, the ending domain distinguished name actually matches up with the group. So again, you can do all that through other methods, but PowerShell made it super, super easy for us. And again, misconfigured domain trust architectures are one of the most common problems we see in big corporate environments. And because even a lot of the admins didn't understand them quite, or maybe the architectures were put in years ago and someone had to inherit it and all that. I know like adminning is really hard. But we've actually had clients that ask for these deliverables, or like that visualization. Oh, sorry, I need to go back. One second. Come on. We've had clients that ask us to build these domain trust like visualizations for them because they didn't have tools that let them really, really easily do that before. And sometimes they see like, testing or dev or something legitimately come out like all the way at the bottom, or someone set up, some kind of little terrible test domain for stuff and people forgot about it without realizing that they're exposing their environment to a huge amount of risk. Again, also just if you can, the real fix is Red Forest or ESAE, like trusted architecture that Microsoft has talked about, but that's also takes time to implement. So again, PowerShell and PowerView make it super easy to map these relationships and enumerate these relationships that kind of cross the boundaries. So this is something that like when my boss was on the NSA Red team way back in the day, this would take them weeks to months to do manually, but I'm able to do it in an afternoon with just one person with better visualizations than they had back in the day using PowerShell. So that's pretty much it, unless there are some questions. Yes?
What are the prerequisites of doing all this stuff? So, meaning domain membership rights?
So what are the prerequisites? Like what rights do you need to do all that? Any domain authenticated user by default is able to enumerate all the information from any Active Directory like database. So you don't have to be an elevated user to pull this, and even across trust, again, if a trust exists, any user can enumerate any information in a foreign domain. Active Directory was built that way as like a lookup database. So people are often surprised at the amount of information that you can pull just as a regular domain user, because it's pretty much nearly all of it. Cool. If not, I'll be out in the hallway. I'll be around all today and tomorrow. This is my last session. So thank you guys so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for getting up at 8:30. I know it's early.